Okay, so if you're watching this, hopefully you've seen the previous video that I made on the movie Leave the World Behind. The reason I'm making this video on the movie How It Ends is because of the feedback that I received. So thank you for everybody that commented on that video. So in this movie, How It Ends, there are several takeaways. Now this one is very heavy on the importance of self-defense.
Now, pretty soon after the movie starts, you start noticing some early indicators. Now, these are all innocuous on their own, and even in the aggregate, it still wouldn't be obvious that something is wrong. So the next day, Sam calls Will before his flight back. She gets scared when she hears a strange sound and says, "Something's wrong," before the line just goes dead. Now, if you have an iPhone, this isn't something that would spark concern. This is just something that happens on a normal daily basis. Something's wrong just means it could be the phone, the telecommunication. You're not going to spring into action at this stage. But when you start adding in other signs, signals per se, that's when you start to see things that other people wouldn't if they're not noticing the aggregate. So the average American has very poor attention to detail as well as situational awareness. And if you've served in the military, you've probably heard the term attention to detail, situational awareness all the time. And that is the distinction that Tom and Will have, as you're soon to discover. One of them has military experience, and you notice the difference just off the bat. So the flight's being canceled, that combined with the signal being wrong, might be something that could make you take concern, but you're not going to spring into action at either of these stages yet. It's still too early to tell if there is an emergency. All right, so early in this movie and throughout, the importance of communications, known as comms, is very important. It's routinely repeated. Now, the reason why ham radio is called the cockroach of comms by many ham operators is that ham radio is usually the last to die, similar to a cockroach. Cockroaches will survive just about anything. Ham radio generally will still work unless there's an EMP attack when cell phones are down, when internet is down, when landlines are down, when power is down, because ham radio is generally built on a backbone of independent repeater stations, solar powered repeater stations. So if the power's out, it's resilient. If the telecommunications, towers, even satellites are down, it's resilient. Now, the radio that they're using in this movie is around 70 years old. It's from the 50s. And it illustrates the importance of having shortwave, because shortwave ham radio was big a while ago before everybody started communicating with modern mechanisms. But what is old generally will become new again during an apocalypse, such as carbureted engines, such as obviously ham radio, old-fashioned hunting and cooking methods. So civilization can go from 21st century to 20th to even 19th century within just a few days during a significant enough emergency. So the importance of comms in this movie is that the father might still be alive if they could have reached Sam by ham. I didn't intend for that to rhyme, but if they could have reached Sam, they wouldn't have had to risk their own lives as well as the life of Tom's wife, who they left behind, to drive there in the old-fashioned way to see if she's okay, and then presumably bring her back the way they came at extreme danger. Such extreme danger, it cost the life of Sam's father and Will's father-in-law. So key swaps could have been another key issue taken from this movie. So actually later in the movie, you can see that it's presumed Sam will leave this message for her fiance. Will, come find me. She gives the address. Now, this is brilliant and also foolish. Brilliant in the sense that she is communicating without conventional communications. Now, this is foolish because she's giving the specific address. So if, per se, somebody wanted to find her and do her harm, they would know where to go. And more likely, they won't intend to do her harm. They're just going to know that perhaps this location has stores, has emergency supplies, so that would be a place to go. So instead, and let me explain what you should do. With a key swap, you would arrange in advance, you would coordinate with 3 to 5 other families, and you would have a key to their house, they would have a key to your house. So your family could evacuate to the nearest home on the list. And if you arrive first and it's not safe there, you had to leave for some reason, then you would write the location of where to go to next. So you don't need to put the specific address because you would have already discussed this with your family members. So it probably wouldn't be possible to say, we will always go from A to B to C to D in linear order. It's most likely that you will know to go to wherever you were told to go from the last location. So whoever arrives home and realizes we needed to evacuate, you would leave a note, you would leave hopefully something, a permanent marker in a prominent location that would be obvious to your family, not obvious to intruders. Perhaps on the back glass, you could use a permanent pen to write on your wall. If it's, white paint, you could use hopefully an effective means that you have readily available. This is why you should have in your go bag, which of course you should have to begin with, some kind of permanent pen. If you have Post-it notes that are the extreme version, those can hold up in the rain. There's also a product called Write in the Rain, which is waterproof paper. You can get a space pen, just look it up by space pen. That will be basically waterproof ink. You can write it upside down. It's all kinds of useful ideas. I hope that you'll find them useful for how to communicate when conventional communications are down. All right, so next, the importance of cash. So no internet means no rideshare. No internet or power means no ATM withdrawals. So what I do, and this could work for you, if it doesn't, then just disregard, is when I go shopping and I have just a few small things to buy, I use my debit card and I just pull out $50 to $100 in cash and I keep it in a zippered pocket on my pants or one of my jackets, whatever I'm wearing at the time. Could even be a backpack. And gradually I've built up some cash reserves. Now in Will's case, fortunately, he had a significant amount of cash. Probably just luck. He probably doesn't seem to be the type to prepare in advance, but the only way he was able to get a ride back to Tom's house was because he was able to use the cash that he had on hand to get to where he needed to go, because Uber will not be working when the grid is down and everybody else is at the airport. In this modern cashless society, it will quickly turn to cash only. And don't expect to use checks. You could expect to barter, but that is a different issue. Cash will be king during an emergency. And you'll see throughout the movie the importance of cash when they're trying to buy gasoline, when they're trying to get emergency repairs to their vehicle. Cash is king. Figure out a way to have cash, to have it stashed safely at your house, and to periodically stash it in safe places on your person, through your pants, your jacket, your backpack. Keep in mind that cash can be washed multiple times without it disintegrating. It's made not just out of paper, but out of, I think, linen. It does hold up very well. And for obvious reasons, they can't expect a paper currency to withstand multi-years of currency circulation if it's not very rugged and designed to get wet. Next, quick decision-making, whether to shelter in place or evacuate. So this was a split-second decision made by Tom and Will. They decided that they were going to drive to rescue the daughter and the fiance. Sam is Tom's daughter. Sam is Will's fiance. They had no way to communicate with her. They assumed the worst. And since they had no ham radio, obviously no cell signal, no satellite phone, no internet, no email, no landline, they decided that their plan E, or Foxtrot F, was to simply drive across the country from Chicago to, I think, Seattle, to locate Sam and then bring her back. So there are risks of sheltering in place, of course. Some of the risks would be you are stuck at home when the threat is encroaching, when there's bands of looting, vigilantes coming across your perimeter, across your property. You will always be outgunned eventually. Some of the risks of evacuating are what and who are you leaving behind. So if you're going to evacuate like Tom and Will did in this case, albeit temporarily, they planned on returning, although only one of them did. Forgive me if I'm spoiling this crappy movie for you, but you should actually thank me. What they did was leave Tom's wife behind, basically to fend for herself. So that's a risk. There are multiple other risks of evacuating and hitting the open road, which these two did. And it starts within the first hour of their trip at the gas station. That could have ended their trip, possibly even ended their life, because one of the attackers has a baseball bat, if they weren't armed and prepared. They end up facing multiple obstacles throughout this movie, each of which could have been life-threatening. So you have to do a quick mental calculation. Now, there's a rule of threes in emergency prepping. And for most preppers, the rule of threes is as follows. So 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, and then it goes, depending on what climate you're in, you might be able to go 3 hours without shelter, sometimes 3 weeks. But the main point is the rule of threes for air, for water, for food. Now, these are obviously rules of thumb because the average American can probably go for a lot longer without food than the average Japanese healthy person who has significantly less stored fuel in their body. But what obviously these preppers are leaving out is the very first preliminary step: make a decision. You basically have 3 seconds to make a decision. That's where the actions subsequent flow from. So if you are hesitating, you are struggling, you are risking the life of yourself and maybe the people around you. So one of the things that some people learn in the military is the OODA loop, and that stands for observe, orient, decide, act. Now, OODA loop is very useful for just everyday decisions. Observe, see what your situation is, get as much situational awareness as you can, that's reasonable. Orient yourself, then make the decision, and then follow the decision. And there's an interesting quote from Colin Powell. I believe he said, never make a decision with less than 40% of the information, nor more than 70%. Now, that took me a while to fully understand and appreciate, but what he's saying is you have to have a minimum amount of information, but you can't wait until you have 100%. First of all, it's impossible. You'll never have all the information. Secondly, you just need to make as best of an assessment as you can under the urgency and go with it. Generally, not always, but generally you can recalibrate and course correct, but make the best decision based on the best amount of information at the time, and then go on. So lastly, Tom already has his bug out bag, assumed that he didn't just go and assemble this and buy this. He had it ready, presumably from his military training. I don't know if he was a quick response force or MARSOC, but this guy's ready. This guy has 2 decades of experience in the military, and he is of the 1% of Americans who are equipped. The other guy, who represents just white collar America, he's a lawyer. I can't think of a more useless skill to have in an emergency. Gasoline. So gasoline is as uncertain as it is important. It's very difficult to store gasoline long term. So a lot of people who have gas generators, first of all, they don't operate their generators enough. So when it goes time to use it, it may not even start. If they left gasoline in it, most likely the fuel lines are plugged. Maybe other components are plugged as well, because modern gasoline has so much ethanol in it. So it's difficult to store gasoline long term. You need to use fuel stabilizers, which I will talk about shortly. You need to mark the date that you filled it so you can do a FIFO, first in, first out. Use the oldest gas first, as long as it's not more than 6 months old if it's untreated, or 1 year if it's treated. You could extend it a little bit longer than 1 year if it's treated and stabilized, but you're pushing it. But you also don't want to have to go get gas in an emergency. First of all, as you saw in this movie, it's cash only. You can't use your credit card. And if you didn't already withdraw the cash, you're not going to be able to, because the ATMs will most likely be inoperable for one of three reasons. They'll already be fully tapped out, or there'll be no power, or thirdly, there'll be no telecommunications connection. They aren't just standalone, they're all interconnected usually. So the difficulties of obtaining gas during the chaos, you're going to subject yourself out in public, and with each passing hour of an emergency, you're going to find people most likely in deeper states of chaos, of confusion, of anxiety, of desperation. Especially if water is not available, that's going to be the first thing that starts to make people go haywire. And then eventually, as food isn't available for themselves, for the children, especially for the babies and infants, people are always going to put their own needs ahead of yours, especially their own children's needs ahead of a stranger. You will not be able to comprehend the desperation that people are going to willingly undertake when they were just calm, law-abiding, benign citizens just days or even hours before. So gasoline will degrade, and this is why you should either store ethanol-free fuel for your generator or use a fuel stabilizer in any fuel that you're going to store long term, which is anything past 3 to 6 months, whether it's in a gas can or in the gas tank of a vehicle that is seldom driven, including RVs. Self-defense. One of the very recurring themes throughout this movie is the importance of self-defense. So the first significant use of self-defense is when Tom and Will are getting gas, and Will falls subject to the first of several traps by the attractive lady who tries to probably shake him down. And then when he rebuffs her offer, the two guys approach him, one with a baseball bat. They look like they're just out of their minds already. And that is just the beginning of multiple instances of needing force for self-defense. Now, it's significant the change that Will undergoes, because at the beginning of this movie, he is shocked and appalled that Tom would use a firearm without Will's knowledge and consent. By the end of the movie, Will is using firearms himself and even saves his life. Again, I'm not going to ask for forgiveness for spoiling this movie. I'm going to ask you to thank me because I spared you an hour and a half of a very mediocre movie. But the emergency preparedness takeaways are far greater than the quality of this film. Desperation will drive some law-abiding people to criminal acts. You need an approach beyond just optimism. So fuel stabilizers, as I talked about in the previous slide, are things that you can add to your gas, whether it's the gas tank or the stored fuel. Generally, you're going to get 3 to 6 months of fuel shelf life when you have it in your car or in a stored gas can. And many people won't store their gas properly. They're going to keep it in a shed where it's going to get very hot or very cold. The volatile organic compounds don't do well with sharp, drastic temperature fluctuations. Gasoline is a volatile compound, as you already know by how explosive and flammable it is. Diesel is a better option. It's not perfect, but it does have a longer shelf life. There's a reason why diesel engines tend to last longer and can run more reliably for longer. Part of why is diesel fuel has its own lubrication built in, but diesel fuel still has a shelf life, obviously. But if you stabilize your diesel fuel, now you're getting the better of both worlds. A longer basic shelf life, further lengthened by the fuel treatment. So as you can see on some of these pictures, if you can read it, the Startron enzyme fill treatment says it protects up to 2 years. If you can get 4-cycle ethanol-free fuel, such as the brand True Fuel, which Home Depot and other places sell, that's expensive. If you think gas is expensive now, wait till you try to fill a tank with that. That would be for your generator. And the reason it would be for your generator is that you can leave this fuel in the generator. It's not going to cause the deposits like highly ethanol rich fuel will. This can be left either in the can if you run your generator dry, which is dangerous and will impact the life of the parts, or you can just leave some of the True Fuel in the fuel lines and it'll be okay to use. And if you don't believe me, test it. Try leaving regular ethanol rich fuel in your generator for 3 months. See how long it takes to start it. Compare that to when you leave the True Fuel in the generator. Watch how much quicker the fuel runs through the fuel lines and how much easier it is for you to start your generator. You can also do this if you have a 2-cycle vehicle, dirt bike, or generator. So if you think that you're going to verbally negotiate past government roadblocks, well, it's fiction, just like this movie. So it doesn't matter that Tom has military experience. He's not likely in real life going to just sweet talk, one of the dozens of guardsmen that are presumably enforcing this government roadblock. It's there for a reason. They're not just going to let you BS your way through it. So blocked passages are a threat that you need to be aware of if you're going to try to evacuate. And in this instance, this is a legitimate government-imposed roadway blockage. Watch what happens later in this movie where you have impromptu blockages by a band of vigilantes. So you have to be cognizant of all the threats you're going to come across if you're going to set out on the road and evacuate versus shelter in place. There are no perfect solutions, and this is almost universally applicable to every aspect of life. There really are just trade-offs. Everything in life is a triage and a trade-off. So it doesn't really make a difference, but Tom in this case doesn't even show or is even asked for any form of identification validating his prior service claim. So it just makes this whole saga of I am a military veteran, I can talk my way through this and it'll be fine, even less probable. And I hope people, especially veterans, aren't thinking, well, they'll treat me different because, we're brothers. No, not going to happen. Knowing who to trust. So one of the evenings, they are pulled over by a police car, but the driver is a presumably escaped inmate from the local maximum security prison who's armed with a shotgun. And the ensuing firefight results in an accident which fractures Tom's ribs. And that presumably is what eventually brings down Tom to his final resting place in the back of the Cadillac. So knowing who to trust. This cop car was highly suspicious. And Tom's situational awareness recognized the prison sign just prior to this incident that said, do not pick up hitchhikers, maximum security prison. So one of the things that they could have done when the cop flashed his lights, well, they could have slowed and perhaps even driven alongside the officer real quick just to make sure this is a legitimate looking officer. As soon as one of them saw this guy, they realized, wait a minute, this is an imposter. There's no way a cop looks like this. And some might even argue that there's likely no good outcome from pulling over during a crisis. Cops are not going to be pulling you over, most likely, for traffic infractions. They might be pulling you over for violating a roadblock, but one option might be, and there's no good options, but one option might be to ignore the signal to pull over until another cop responds. That presumably will be a legitimate officer. In this case, they could have driven and seen this fake cop, realize that he's not calling for backup. Anytime you don't pull over, there's going to be backup eventually. And if they just continue on their way, worst case scenario, if they are legitimate cops, is they're going to be taken into custody and at least protected, presumably. But in this case, they were risking their life through their gullibility by believing that this imposter was actually a legitimate law enforcement agent, and it almost cost them both their life. So knowing who to trust is going to be exceedingly difficult. That's why you need to form relations now with your neighbors, with your community, because for many reasons, sheltering in place could be your best bet. And it's important to know by face who your friendly neighbors are, to be able to tell the difference between outsiders that may wish to come in and steal what you have stored versus the friendly community members of which you all are keeping each other afloat. Each one of you hopefully will have a useful skill that augments each other, and your strength in numbers is almost always a benefit. When you set out on your own, you are putting yourself at exorbitant risk. Just the two of these guys against the myriad threats that they faced, there was no reasonable expectation that they could have driven across country during this grid down, basically current and post-apocalyptic environment and not come across some major threats. And if Tom hadn't been armed, then this whole trip never even really would have started past the gas station. Cover and concealment. So you need cover and concealment to hide yourself, to hide your supplies, especially if you've evacuated and maybe you need to sleep somewhere for the night. That's when you're going to be perhaps your most vulnerable state. Now, night vision goggles, which might sound outlandish, can really augment both your cover and concealment while counteracting the cover and concealment by threats. So one of the advantages of having strength in numbers, such as through a community watch that you've set up, is that one person could take turns having the night vision goggles, the NVGs on, looking outside at the perimeter, because you will presumably see them even before they even see you. You could also use it for hunting purposes. And if you have to drive somewhere like Tom and Will did with their lights off, well, presumably their night vision goggles would have prevented the eventuality of them going off-road after they swerved to avoid the deer and basically crashing their car. They could have driven without their headlights on for miles, many miles, with just their night vision goggles on. You would just need a way to recharge them, which they don't go into in this movie of emergency power very much, but that opens up the discussion for keeping your devices charged, and there's multiple ways to do that I have covered in other videos. So another danger of evacuation is that you probably won't have the parts or the special knowledge and the very expensive tools to diagnose and make repairs to a modern vehicle. And that's assuming you can even drive the car if there wasn't, an EMP attack, hopefully. So you probably won't find mechanics on duty or be able to get specialized auto parts during a grid down emergency. Mechanics are going to be taking care of themselves and their families back at home. They're not going to be showing up to work. So your best bet could be to try to swap cars if you can. If you can find someone who maybe has perished in their car, but the keys are still there and they still have fuel. This is why it might be a useful item to carry a fuel pump, although it is much more difficult to siphon fuel from modern pumps, modern fuel tanks in cars. You could, if you know how to work on cars and you know exactly what's wrong, poach the parts, as they basically do in this movie, and they do a half-assed radiator repair. So they do find someone, Ricky, who can fix their car and agrees to travel with them in case they break down again. And what prompted this? Well, there are two things. Ricky kind of wanted to get off the reservation, but secondly, they had cash to offer her. She didn't fall for Tom's dim-witted offer of, oh yeah, if we get to where we're going, I'll send you the money, no problem. Yeah, right. Even in normal times, that would still be a yeah, right. So cash is key, and that was what enabled them to continue on. It really is amazing that they've made it this far. Restock supplies as you go. So Ricky and Tom and Will find this kind of creepy abandoned water park, and stupidly, Ricky wants to go for a swim in that disgusting water, but more intelligently, she finds a knocked over vending machine, takes as much of the snacks as she can, takes gas, they take other supplies, and that's smart. You should restock with what you can reasonably transport. So if you have the luxury of a vehicle with you, you can obviously carry a heck of a lot more supplies than after that vehicle is broken down and you are resorting to walking on foot. So don't take a hoarder's amount of supplies, because that's just going to weigh you down and be counterproductive. But again, everything in life is a triage and a trade-off. Triage by taking the most important things first, emphasize clean, potable water, first aid if you can find it, hygiene yourself if you have the chance, take your food, take some extra clothing if you've already destroyed your clothes or it's covered in sweat, and think about first priorities first, necessities over preferences. And then with traps, there's multiple traps that they fall into during this movie. So for example, at one point, robbers hold the three of them at gunpoint, stealing their gasoline and making them realize, Tom and Will, that without fuel, they're doomed. So Will chases and catches up with the fleeing car as he's driving. And then Ricky shoots out their tires. Fortunately, she knows how to handle a weapon, causing the vehicle to flip over. And then they reclaim their gas. Just cliche action movie, walking away from the exploding car at the last minute. But it's important to recognize that you cannot save everyone. So I don't know whether the directors intended these to be lessons, but regardless, they are valuable lessons from this not so valuable movie. You need to recognize that everything has to be triaged. You can only support yourself and your family. You cannot support everyone. You cannot support strangers. You have to focus on what is most important first. And not everything is a first priority. Only one thing at a time can be your first priority. So you need to decide whether it's yourself, your spouse, your kids, your pets, which one. Can't be all of them. You won't have enough water, food, first aid. You absolutely need to come to terms with the fact that you do have the ability to save other people's lives, but you don't have the ability to save everyone's life. And if you try, then everyone will suffer and possibly die. You also need to understand the importance of self-defense, which I think Will is starting to learn by this point. So they fell for this, seemingly helpless woman. Will decided to pull over and help her, and she was just a decoy, because as soon as they stopped to help her, these guys came out and robbed Will and Tom. They were armed as well. They overpowered the one single handgun that Tom and Will had between them. But that's why Will and Tom chased after them and got their fuel back, because they would have died without it. First aid. So the next day after this, Tom, who had an injured lung from the crash, collapses. Now, fortunately, and how likely is this, Will has to perform a needle decompression thoracostomy, an NDT. And it just so happens that in Tom's go bag, he has one of these needles. How many of you have a needle for an NDT? Now, there's other ways to do it if you don't have the needle, but if you are going to build a first aid kit, which you should keep in your car so you can have it automatically if you have to evacuate, even if it's in your car, your car is going to be at home when you're at home, presumably most of the time. So at least you always know where your first aid kit is. It goes with you. And in this case, the NDT was what saved Tom's life. Tom was able to explain to Will where to inject it because he had a collapsed lung, also called a pneumothorax. But what if a collapsed lung happened to your child or spouse or parent? Would you know what to do if you couldn't even call 911? Would you even know how to respond to the top 10 most common medical emergencies? Do you even know what the top 10 or 11 medical emergencies are? Well, I'll talk about that in the next slide. So what supplies, what knowledge do you have today? And if it's very minimal, then what can you start to acquire this weekend? Just start somewhere. Wherever you are, just start at N+1. Just start to add so you are in better shape next weekend and in better shape the weekend after that. And that's the best way to do it. Slowly, gradually, and just better than you were on an incremental basis. All right, so here are the commonly known top 10 medical emergencies in the US. Now, these are all very common. There might be some change in the exact order. Forgive me if you take issue with this. I don't really care, but yeah, you can. You can let me know through the comments if I totally missed an obvious one. I don't think COVID is number one, but it sure seems like a lot of people assume it is. So heart attacks are the number one. They affect about 800,000 people in the US every year. And if you know what to keep an eye out for, then, and this is just for everyday life, this isn't just for apocalypse and grid down. This is for when you suddenly notice in yourself or someone else things like chest pain, specifically sensations of pressure or tightness in the center of the chest, or coughing and wheezing that is very serious, more than just from a cold. And then some of the other symptoms could be confused for other ailments like feeling dizzy or lightheaded, having a sense of anxiety. But something more specific is pain in the left arm starting from the chest. And if anyone is exhibiting these symptoms, first call an ambulance. Better yet, you start giving CPR while you tell someone else to call the ambulance, so you can continue doing CPR and not have to try to juggle the phone and the CPR. It's very unlikely that you're going to cause undue harm to someone through CPR. It's far more likely that they will experience extreme harm by not having it done. So stroke. Stroke can happen when the blood flow in the brain is blocked, or if there's a ruptured vessel in the brain. You don't need to remember the difference between ischemic and hemorrhagic strokes. Just know that if there's blood flow in the brain that's blocked or ruptured vessel, you're basically going to have a stroke. It's not you, it's usually someone else that you're thinking of at this time. So immediate care is necessary. And there's an acronym called FAST, F-A-S-T, to remember the warning signs for stroke. And it stands for F, facial drooping on one side. A, arm weakness or numbness, typically in just one arm. S, speech difficulties, such as slurred speech. T, time. If you see any of these symptoms, then you need to seek immediate medical attention, because none of these things are guaranteed. They may not help, but they can only help. 3, choking. I don't need to explain choking, but some of the signs to look out for are clutching the throat. Sounds cliche, but it's pretty common for choking victims. Inability to talk. If you're choking, you're probably not going to be able to talk or whistle. And then loss of consciousness. Making squeaking sounds when you're trying to breathe or talk. Turning blue in the face. And if someone is choking, then you know the Heimlich. If you don't learn it, watch a YouTube video. You could also try back blows or chest thrusts. Know the difference for how to do a Heimlich on an adult, on a child, and on an infant. Some might even want to know how to do it on their pet. And then severe allergic reactions. So I keep an EpiPen in my first aid kit. Now these are not easy to get. And I don't know why you have to have a prescription for an EpiPen, because they're life-saving, and the potential benefit that you could get from using EpiPen almost always will outweigh the potential risks of using it incorrectly. Of course, there's risks to using an EpiPen, but the risk of not using an EpiPen when someone is going through anaphylactic shock are obviously overwhelming. And over 100 million people in the US experience allergies every year, but some of these are life-threatening. And if you notice something like a weak and rapid pulse, difficulty breathing or swallowing due to constriction of airways, and you've ruled out choking, or major skin reactions, such as, the skin is even turning blue or gray or pale, the tongue is swelling, you're wheezing or coughing, and you've ruled out choking, of course, then if you or someone else is exhibiting these signs, then use an EpiPen auto-injector if it's prescribed, and then get them to an ER if it's possible. So if you are camping, backcountry, someone gets stung by a bee, and maybe they didn't even know they were allergic, maybe they didn't even have an EpiPen, but usually if they have knowledge of their allergy, they will have an EpiPen. That would be the first thing to ask them if they can still talk. Do you have an EpiPen? Point to where your EpiPen is. They usually will have it with them in some area. But if you can get one now, which you probably won't be able to get without a prescription, that would be potentially a great thing to consider adding to your first aid kit. Just learn how to use it and when. Seizures. So about 1 in every 10 people have a seizure during their lifetime. And if that person has epilepsy, then that generally requires medical attention. But if they just have one seizure, they still should get medical attention if possible, but it isn't as serious as someone who has epilepsy. So a person who's about to go into a seizure could exhibit strange signs like looking into space, or twitching movements, or stiffening of the body, as well as involuntarily uncontrollable shaking or jerking. So if that person is having a seizure, the CDC recommends that you stay with that person until the seizure ends, tell the person what happened once they've recovered, offer to call a taxi to make sure they reach home safely. And if the seizure is ongoing, remember, don't hold them down, because doing so could be dangerous for you and the patient. Number 6, respiratory distress. So any type of breathing difficulty can be brought on by lung inflammation or infection. And some of the things to look for are crackling sound in the lungs or shortness of breath. And if that happens, just first thing to do, call an ambulance, and then if necessary, consider doing CPR, but make sure you call the ambulance just to start that clock. You could loosen their clothing, help them rest a bit, monitor their airway. But again, CPR first, if you can have someone else call the ambulance. Traumatic injuries. In 1998, traumatic injuries were responsible for the death of about 5.8 million people worldwide. And we've come a long way in terms of technology to reduce traumatic injuries and reduce the impact of them, like motorcycle helmet laws, etc. But it's still important to know how to stabilize fractures and control bleeding. So consider, if you have a go bag, what you could do to have an impromptu splint. You can make them out of newspapers or any other solid object that you can wrap around a fractured limb to keep it from worsening. Burns. So understand what the different severities of burns are. Understand what you should and should not do for burns. I don't have time to go into that on this video, but there are other videos that I've made that talk about first aid specifically, and the different types of first, second, third degree burns and appropriate treatments. There's even special types of pre-packaged gauze that are designed for burns. You don't want to do butter. Careful of those old wives' tales for treating burns. But if someone is burned, that's probably one of the easiest ailments to identify. And then acute abdominal emergencies. So that could be appendicitis or GI perforations or obstructions, all requiring urgent care. And that's happening a lot more recently with things like Ozempic. So keep in mind that you could plan for all types of first aid, all types of emergencies, but some of these things you're not going to be able to treat without professional medical care. That's why you at least want to control for the low-hanging fruit by stocking your first aid kit with as many of the reasonable methods and equipment that you can for the most common injuries that you can actually treat yourself. And then lastly, infectious diseases, and then diabetic emergencies. So hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar, diabetic ketoacidosis, need prompt treatment. If you have honey sticks in your first aid kit, that can be helpful. What can be really helpful is just not getting type 2 diabetes to begin with. If you have type 1, well, that's probably not your fault. It is not your fault. So another hazard of evacuation. So there was a bandit roadblock that they encountered where they encountered a gang of armed men on motorcycles. These are not cops. These are not National Guardsmen. But Will and Tom worked together to evade the gang. But unfortunately, through this process, Tom succumbed to his wounds. And the car finally breaks down, and Will burns it so he doesn't have to leave Tom's body. But Will then sets out on foot. Now, after that, a family picks Will up and leads them to his estranged father's empty house in Idaho. He strikes a deal with them, taking their four-wheel drive vehicle in exchange for them staying at his father's house because there's supplies there. It's well stocked until they're ready to go north. And then as he gets closer to Seattle, Will sees that the city is almost just completely destroyed. And then he notices that they're buried in their cars. These people are just buried in their cars in a thick layer of ash. So unfortunately, that is an opportunity, as unfortunate as it sounds, to poach supplies. These people are dead. They're not going to need the supplies anymore. So they presumably have cars that if they're still running, have the keys in them. They died in their car. So he could have commandeered one of the many vehicles if they're still able to be driven. If he had a fuel pump, he could find, the one working vehicle, siphon the fuel from the surrounding cars. Hopefully he could find a way to store some extra fuel and be on his way. But these modern cars, which are all fuel injected or have an EV battery pack, which is probably even more sensitive, are not going to run if there was some kind of EMP event. But an older car, such as, before the 70s, most likely, might be carbureted. And that is supposedly, because nobody really knows this until it happens, supposedly more resilient from an EMP, electromagnetic pulse event, if it's carbureted. So back to the rule of threes. Again, 3 minutes without air, which means you probably won't consider a gas mask because you've never gone 3 minutes without air. You've never needed a gas mask, which is called a respirator. But a CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear respirator might enable you to collect abandoned supplies outside when others cannot or have perished. And I don't know if this is a message from the directors, but that's exactly what Will does in this movie. He finds a respirator from a fire truck, puts it on, and now he can breathe in this environment where it is not practical, it's not safe for people to be outside. So if you're interested in a respirator, then consider a mirror safety hazmat respirator. The CM6M is the one that I like. It's full face and you can drink through it. It also has a diaphragm for speaking. And the final instance of self-defense shows how long a way this guy has come. So proud of him. So in this final instance of self-defense, Will finds Sam with Jeremiah. He was a neighbor from that apartment building, and Will and Jeremiah obviously have some tension there. So Will has to basically shoot and kill Jeremiah because it was just obvious what was about to happen. So the gun saves Will's life, and this is not the first or even second time this happens throughout this movie. Will finally appreciates the importance of defensive firearms. Now, I'm not here to sing the praises of guns. They obviously are a trade-off, just like everything else in life. There are many risks to having one, and just like with chess or jiu-jitsu, anything you use exposes you to vulnerability. So if you're going to use a gun, you better be prepared and knowledgeable on its use. If you're going to bring a gun out, expect somebody else is going to use either their gun or your gun, if you can't control it, against you. If you're buying your first gun, don't expect to suddenly be able to use it in an emergency without training. You won't be able to hit the target as easily as you think you will, as easily as it seems in the movies, and it might not even fire if you are not intimately familiar with its operation, with its safety, and its maintenance. So learn the maintenance, learn how to carry it, how to store it, and the use of laws for your state.
If you found this video helpful and you'd like me to do more on other silly apocalyptic movies, please let me know. And hopefully more than just my grandma and my wife will watch this video.
But this is all done in my off time, so I just want to make sure my time is well spent, not just for me, but for all of you as well. Thank you for your time.